Events written and recorded and reiterated by Paul specifically for the last generation, those who live at the end of the age. Today we have an issue that is affecting ecclesias everywhere in the world. Another problem common to man. A greatly positive lesson also coming from Reuben and Gad. In this record we're going to see Moses extremely angry, more angry than the rebellion of Korah, more angry than the murmurers who so often came besieging him on several occasions. But we are going to see out of this confrontation between Moses and the children of Reuben and Gad and Manasseh, we're going to see wonderful progress made in the spiritual outlook of the elders of Reuben and Gad and Manasseh. And they make a remarkable covenant that is to permeate the next 7 years of Israel's history. But it's the progress we want to focus on, the fact that they get it right in the end. This is important to us because we live in the last days. In the 2nd of Timothy chapter 3, we are told very specifically about the days in which we live. You know, there are only several passages of the New Testament you can say are totally applicable to us. And this is one of them. Know also, says Paul, in the last days perilous or dangerous times shall come. And I want you to notice the prime characteristic of the last days predicted by the Apostle Paul. Men shall be lovers of their own selves, self-interested, self-consumed. No longer people giving themselves for their country, no longer giving themselves in service by volunteering. In Australia we have a crisis of volunteering. It's only the old people that will volunteer. The younger generation are so consumed with themselves and their own pleasures, lovers of pleasures more than lovers of God. And they are the dangerous times we live in. This self-interest was a product of the humanism doctrine. When they said there was no God, no future, no judgment, then life becomes all about looking after yourself. And the humanists described it as the good life theory. Our existence is about the good life, which means looking after number one, getting the best out of life for yourself. And sadly, that doctrine has infiltrated the thinking of many members of our ecclesia. You know, the world saw it this way. And these are magazine covers from the 90s, the me decade they called the 90s. It's all about me. Well, we now live in the postmodern world, and we've moved on from the humanism of the 90s. This is now what you have. The me generation. You know, we were in Montreal last week doing a bit of touring around, and I was absolutely amazed to see that people were not just taking photographs of statues and old buildings. They had these long sticks with their phones on them, and they stood in front of the statue and got into the picture. Because it's about the me generation, and selfies are what it's all about, isn't it? Men shall be lovers of their own selves. Look how Facebook is used. Do I really need to know what you're having for tea? Now, I know my brother does this, but do I need to know what you're having for tea? I don't really need to know that. But somehow you think I need to know. And so we come to the postmodern world. It rejects conformity. It rejects commitment to structure. You know, in a recent survey of religion done in Australia by our leading sociologist, he actually found that amongst young people, the category of belief that they chose was SBNR, spiritual but not religious. They rejected being conformed to any organisation. They did not want to be part of anything that controlled their lives. But they wanted the spiritual, they wanted the Christ-like spirit of being a good person, of doing good to other people, but as long as I wasn't restricted by conformity to an organisation. Spiritual but not religious. That's the major category that young people in Australia put themselves into. And that's a product of humanism and postmodernism. And we're going to see that it was common to man back in the times of Moses. Now, First, we must do a history lesson on Reuben and Gad, because Reuben made a very poor start in history. Now, bear in mind, when we start the chapter, it's Reuben and Gad. Later on, we find Manasseh comes into the picture, because they were the silent sympathisers behind this change to ecclesial policy. When they saw that Reuben and Gad were making progress, they jumped on board. So we have three tribes that are interested in this particular matter, but they made a bad start, particularly Reuben. Now, you know the story. I'm going to quote these to you. I want you to go to Genesis 49, but we start in Genesis 35 with Reuben's disgraceful taking of his father's handmaid. Very likely an abuse of power within the family, the oldest son putting pressure on the handmaid. But as we know from the times of David and Adonijah, taking your father's handmaid or wife was a grasp at all the authority of the family. And that's how Jacob saw it. It was an act of defiance. It was an act of challenge. Maybe it was done by Reuben because his father was already showing favouritism to Joseph and Benjamin. Whatever the motive that he did it, Reuben did it. He dishonoured his father. It was a great family shame. And Jacob never, ever forgot it. It came up time and time again. He gave Joseph the tunic of palms, the coat of many colours. The garment of the family priesthood was passed on. It should have been Reuben's by right of being the firstborn. It went to Joseph. When Joseph was sold by his brethren, Reuben failed to lead. He left Joseph in the hands of his brothers and went away. He then joined their deception of their own father. He did not go after the Ishmaelites to buy Joseph back. He lied to Jacob. He watched his father fall into terrible grief and said nothing. And he's the eldest. He's the firstborn of the family. And while you're in Genesis, have a look at chapter 42 and verse 37. If ever there was an indication of the lack of character in the man Reuben, it's in Genesis 42 and verse 37, when Simeon is in Egypt and they have to take Benjamin. And the family's debating what to do. Reuben says in Genesis 42 and verse 37, he said to his father, if I don't bring back Simeon, then you can have the pleasure of killing your own grandchildren. I mean, what grandfather's going to take that as an offer? I mean, what a stupid thing to say. No wonder Jacob said, well, one thing's for sure, my son Benjamin won't go with you. If you're willing to offer up your children to be slain for your stupidity, I'm not interested, said Jacob. That's the sort of guy he was. Terribly insensitive and thoughtless. Well, in Genesis 49, we have the blessing of Jacob upon his sons. And there is a great irony in this. Verse 3. Reuben, my firstborn, the one who should be my might, my strength, the excellency of dignity, the excellency of power, my firstborn son, useless. Useless. Unstable as water. You'll never be anything. You'll never excel. Why? Because you challenged your own father by taking his concubine. He went up to my couch. He never forgot that, brethren and sisters. He's on his deathbed. That was an incredibly bitter and sarcastic blessing that he got. I want you to just take a note of that, because I'm going to show you the blessing that Moses gives Reuben at the end of Moses' life. And you'll see how different it is, because Reuben, the tribe, makes progress. Genesis 48, verse 5. The blessing of Joseph. A double portion. Thy sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Right? Jacob says, they're mine. As Reuben and Simeon, they shall be mine. And the elder sons were now being displaced by the sons of Joseph at the top of the family. A double portion was given to Joseph. In verse 22 of chapter 48, I've given you another portion, extra portion, above thy brethren, Joseph. And it was the plot of land at Shechem where Jacob had dug his well. It was the one bit of ground that the family did own beside the cave of Machpelah. It was given to Joseph. A remarkable history. You can follow that right through the scriptures until the moment the Lord Jesus Christ comes and sits on Jacob's well, and underneath his feet are the bones of Joseph and his brethren. And I can imagine the bones of Joseph tingling with excitement as the one that he'd typed so brilliantly sat on that well. They were all buried in Shechem. And that was given to Joseph. The family inheritance was given to him. The kingship went to Judah, the priesthood to Levi, and Reuben was left out of all the honours of the family. Then we come down to Deuteronomy 27. Don't worry to go there, you know the story. When they went into the land, conquered Jericho, Ai, and then they marched the whole nation up to Shechem, to the inheritance of Jacob, stood them on two mountains, Ebal and Gerizim, and they repeated the blessings and cursings of Deuteronomy 28 to each other across the valley. And on the mount of cursing were the four sons of the handmaids, Leah's youngest son, Asher. And you know, the tribe of Asher is the most anonymous tribe in the Bible. You tell me some great hero, prophet, king, priest, or something that came from Asher. No one. Know nothing else about them. And that's 5. Who else would make up the 6 on Mount Gerizim, or Mount Ebal, sorry, the Mount of Cursing? Well, it was good old Reuben, the firstborn of the family, over there with the handmaids. What an insult that was, because Reuben had made a very poor start in history. So you see, can't you, how much Reuben had made a bad start. And so we come to Numbers 32. Let's go back there and pick up this record of this confrontation they have with Moses. Put it in history, they were on the edge of the land. So Israel has come across, where are we? Whoops. Here we are. Israel's come across the River Jordan. Oh, sorry, they're still on the west side of Jordan in Numbers 32. They haven't yet crossed over. The kingdom's in sight. They can see the land of Abraham across the waters. They have defeated all the nations on the east of Jordan. So Sihon and Og and the Moabites have all been sorted out. The Midianites have been sorted out. In the battle against Midian in chapter 31 and verse 49, when Phinehas led the battle, remarkably it says in verse 49, "Thy servants have taken the sum of the men of war which were under our charge, and we're not missing one." They had gone to war against the Midianites, and not one Israelite had died in that battle. That's a miracle in itself. So all of the east of Jordan is now subdued. They're preparing to cross over. And out of the blue comes a problem before Moses which appears almost insignificant in what it was asking. It occupies a whole chapter. It is referred to in detail 4 more times in the record of the Old Testament. Now you contrast that to the 38 years, of which only 2 or 3 incidents are recorded. This one, a whole chapter and 4 complicated references later on to it. This is an important incident that God has recorded for us. So let's just see what happens in verse 1. The children of Reuben and Gad specialised in the keeping of cattle. And having conquered and walked through the eastern land, they decided that they were very good at keeping cattle. And this land was a good place for their cattle. So it seems to be a very innocuous request. But you see, it's a change, a dramatic change to ecclesial policy. Moses had said that everybody must go over Jordan and fight until all the Canaanites have been defeated before they get their inheritance. They want to get their inheritance right now. In verse 33, you find that the Manasserites join in, because Moses says he gave to them, to the children of Gad and children of Reuben and the half-tribe of Manasseh, the kingdom of Sihon and Og. So the Manasserites were waiting behind to see what Reuben and Gad would get away with, but they were there too. And then verse 2, they come to Moses and they make their request. We've seen this land, it's a beautiful country for cattle. We've got lots of cattle. It's very logical that we should not go over Jordan but stay here. And it seems like a sensible request, doesn't it? A fairly innocuous request. But there's a sting in the tail. And the sting there's in verse 5. Oh, by the way, it means that we won't go over Jordan. And Moses reacts. You see, the whole ecclesia had fought to conquer the east of Jordan. And now they're opting out. Now, the Moses' reaction from verse 6 to verse 15 that we read is intense, it's strong, and it's heated. It's a tirade. If we'd been standing next to Moses while he sounds off these 9 verses, I reckon most of us would have thought, well, I thought he was a meek and mild man, this Moses. He gave them a tongue lashing that was second to none. You know, in verse 8 to 13, he compares them to the 10 faithless spies. In verse 9, who discouraged the heart of the children of Israel. He likens them to the faithless generation who were lost in the wilderness, whose bones were strewn along, who will never enter God's rest. He says, you're worse than them. And he says in verse 7, wherefore discourage you the heart of the children of Israel. And the margin has, you break the heart of your brethren by your request. You're just like the 12 spies, or the 10 spies. You know, we would call this a right royal dressing down. They went back to their tents with their ears burning. Look at what he says in verse 14 and 15 as he concludes his little speech. You are risen up in your father's stead, an increase of sinful men. You're worse than all the ones of the past. You're going to bring down the fierce anger of Yahweh upon Israel. We're all going to die in the wilderness because of you. And you'll destroy the people. And they're backing off saying, all we want is a place for our cattle. Why does Moses get so angry? Well, this is why, brethren and sisters. The real issue is there in verse 6 and 7. You know, these are incredibly important words. A statement you'd have underlined in your Bibles. And perhaps would be a good thing to put upon parts of your house. I used to say in Australia, a good thing to put on your television set. I'm not sure if you have television sets, but particularly when the Bible class is on, it would be a very interesting statement. Why do you sit here and your brethren go to war? And that's exactly how Moses saw it. You discourage the hearts of your brethren. You imagine what would happen if they were given to settle on the east of Jordan without going over and fighting the Canaanites. Moses said, what will happen? There'll be a great defection. Everybody else will want to join Reuben, Gad and Manasseh. They will all give up on the fight against the Canaanites and come over here where everything's been conquered and settle in peace. They're facing walled cities, giants, Canaanite armies, the sons of Anak, chariots of iron. And you want to sit here in conquered territory and do nothing? You're going to divide the nation. You're worse than the 10 spies. And Moses hits on very important issues for ecclesial life, brethren and sisters. We cannot divorce ourselves from the battles of the ecclesia out of selfish interest. The decisions we make do matter in life. You know, they hadn't intended to hurt anybody. They were just making a practical decision which was good for their economy. We have cattle, good land for cattle, no problem. What they failed to see was that their decision was going to discourage and break the hearts of their brethren. And discouragement and disillusionment can spread so easily in ecclesial life. It is far harder to inspire and to encourage and make people feel it's worth going on. You can spread poison very easily in ecclesial life. And very few decisions we make are intended to harm or discourage anybody. But in the truth, we are not at liberty to please ourselves and forget God's ecclesia. We are not islands in the truth. We cannot act unilaterally to exercise our liberties. Whether we like it or not, we are all our brother's keeper. Everything we're told about the judgment seat of Christ indicates that the benchmark of judgment is going to be the impact we had on other people. As you have done it, or not done it, says the Lord Jesus Christ, to the least of these my brethren, you've done it unto me. The issue will be, has the profession of your love turned to practical assistance to your ecclesia and your brethren and sisters? Has your acceptance of Christ translated into sacrifice of self for those for whom Christ died? They're going to be the benchmarks of judgment, brethren and sisters. Brother Roberts put it this way: if thy brother be grieved with thy meat, now walkest thou not in love. Destroy him not with thy meat, for whom Christ died. It is good neither to eat flesh, nor to drink wine, or anything, whether thy brother stumbleth, or is offended, or is made weak. And Brother Roberts comments, it is manifested by the law of Christ. We are under an obligation to consider the bearing of our actions on others. If we are indifferent on this head, we may find ourselves unexpectedly confronted with unknown responsibilities in the day of account. You know, we have to consider the bearings of our actions upon others. They were thinking about themselves. They failed to see the damage they would do to the ecclesia by their selfishness. And we're all trying to get each other into the land of promise. We are at war against the giants of Anak, against the three unclean spirits abroad in the world, against strongholds of reason and humanism. There are Canaanites and Amalekites still taking off the weak. In our case, they call themselves ex-Christadelphians. If you know anything about their website, you know how dangerous they are to unstable young people. The Amalekites are still out there, brethren and sisters, and so are the Canaanites all around us with their depravity. It's not a time to detach ourselves from the battle the ecclesia has. What about your attendance at the things your ecclesia arranges? Bible class and lecture. It's been pointed out to me many times that mere attendance will not get us into the kingdom. And that's probably partly true. But not coming is going to limit our growth. It's going to discourage other people from going. You ask yourself, if the future of your ecclesia depended upon your commitment to the Bible class and the lectures, would they continue? If the gospel proclamation was a multiplication of your commitment and effort, would it achieve the purpose of being a lampstand for Christ? What are we saying when we're not at the ecclesial events, brethren and sisters? How discouraging for a brother who's prepared to exhort the ecclesia and people don't bother to come. How discouraging for the gospel committee when the same ones have to do the seminars month after month, year after year, and not get much support. Well, we can all justify our non-attendance, can't we? We're too tired, we've got work commitments, we've got other problems to deal with. But put on a film night with a big T, and the whole ecclesia will turn up. Put on a birthday party. We get a great attendance. You know, somehow our priorities can get a bit mixed up. We had in our ecclesia once an old sister who was at the time over 85, in a wheelchair, very infirm. She used to regularly come out to the Bible class, even in the middle of winter. And I heard someone say to her once, Auntie Alice, why do you bother? Why do you bother to get dressed up and come out to the meeting in the cold? And she said to us, what else have I got? What am I going to do sitting back there in the nursing home? And I found that incredibly encouraging, that she actually had the determination to come out, and she encouraged people by the fact that she came. Be sure our unwarranted absence will surely break hearts slowly. But if we do contribute and we all go and support each other, we go home feeling inspired, encouraged and enthusiastic, exhorting one another while it is yet called today. And Moses said, why sit ye here while your brethren go to war? Not a bad slogan to put on your armchair. Because there are many challenges in the truth and we can easily detach ourselves from them. And they didn't mean to hurt anybody, but their selfishness did. You know, when you go through the Bible, these are the principles of service to which we are encouraged to undertake. Be thou an example of the believers. What we do and what choices we make does matter. Use not your liberty for an occasion to serve the flesh. We have rights, we have liberty, but by love, serve one another. In Acts 20 verse 35, Paul's motto that he picked up from the words of Christ: it is more blessed to give than to receive. The house of Stephanos, says Paul, were addicted to the ministry. They were drug addicts. Look at the word, it's pharmakia. They were absolutely drug addicts to the service of the brethren and sisters. John talks about fellow helpers to the truth. No matter how humble your role, be a fellow helper to the truth. Strengthen the things that remain, said Jesus. Spend and be spent for others was Paul's attitude to life. Bear one another's burdens and fulfill the law of Christ. Always abounding in the work of the Lord. You know, I've had people justify to me or try and justify why they don't bother with the Bible class. I get nothing out of it, they say. It does nothing for me. Is that really the point? It's the contribution we make, isn't it? And the children of Gad and Manasseh and Reuben had let selfish interest intrude upon their responsibilities. Now come back to verse 16. You know, you've got to read the record carefully. It's very apparent they went back to their tents with their ears burning, and they thought it through. And this is where we start to see remarkable progress being made by Reuben, Gad and Manasseh. And it says they came near unto him. So it means they came back, all right? So they thought about it and they came back. And this is their little speech. They said, we will build sheepfolds here for our cattle and city for our little ones, but we ourselves, the men of war, we will go ready armed before the children of Israel until we have brought them into their place. Our little ones shall dwell in the fenced cities because of the inhabitants of the land. We will not return to our houses until the children of Israel have inherited every man his inheritance. We will not inherit on the other side beyond Jordan. Our lot is fallen here. Now, we don't know by what means they could say their lot was fallen here. They thought it was appropriate, that this was a good place for cattle. There had been no calling of lots for the division of the land. So we don't know on what basis they could say that. But they do make an incredibly vital promise here. And they came back in trepidation. Because, you know, they address Moses as our Lord. You know, my Lord Moses, they call him. So, you know, they're in trepidation of Moses because of his anger that he had on the first occasion. But there was a great contrition in this. There was a commitment. They were willing to leave their families on the other side of Jordan and go over with their brethren to fight the Canaanites, and only when the Canaanites were defeated to come back to their inheritance. They had no idea how long it would take. It turned out to be 7 years. That's a long time to leave your families unprotected over on the east. Now, what's fascinating is that there's no dispute by Moses about the fact that they would have this inheritance. Moses focuses upon the good intention in the promise that they made. He says in verse 20, if you will do this thing, if you will go armed before Yahweh to war, over Jordan, till Yahweh's enemies have all been subdued, verse 22, this land shall be your possession before Yahweh. So Moses says, okay, you can have this land on the condition you do what you said you're going to do. But verse 23, if you don't do what you say, you will have sinned against Yahweh, your sin will find you out. And he warned them. Verse 30, the same thing. If you will not pass over, then you'll be dragged over to the west with the rest of the nations, and you'll get a lousy inheritance. So they were warned very severely that they must do what they said. If you don't do what you've promised, then you will lose the east. So Moses accepts that they would get the east, but they have to keep their promise. Now, this promise that they made became a vital covenant in Israel. We're going to come back to this slide later on, but I want to just show you how important it became. And we need to follow these through. God held them to their promise. In Deuteronomy chapter 3, let's go there and look at what it says there. So this is Moses writing his last words, reiterating the history of Israel. And he builds into his last words of Deuteronomy, he builds in the covenant. Verse 18, at that time I commanded you, saying, Yahweh your God has given you this land to possess it. You shall pass over armed before your brethren. He's talking to the Reubenites and the Gadites in verse 16. So he says, remember Reuben and Gad and Manasseh, what you promised. You promised that you would pass over armed before your brethren of the children of Israel. Verse 20, until Yahweh have given rest unto your brethren. So Moses writes it into Deuteronomy. Remember what you promised you were going to do. Now notice it says there, I want you to just notice and put a few words aside in your mind. In verse 18 and verse 20, you're passing over with your brethren. That's going to come up in our last talk again. They had to see that they were not disconnecting themselves from their brethren. Okay. Come to Joshua chapter 1. Moses dies. Joshua takes over. Joshua chapter 1 is about the encouragement that God gave to Joshua to lead the nation. You would expect in Joshua 1 that many things had to be covered with Joshua. The leadership of the nation, the conquest of the land. What's the first issue that Joshua has to deal with in Joshua chapter 1? So God's command goes down to verse 10 or verse 9. God's commission to Joshua. Come to verse 12. The very first thing that Joshua reminds the nation of Israel of is the covenant that Reuben, Gad and Manasseh made. He says to these people, remember the words of Moses the servant which he commanded you. Given you rest, he's given you your inheritance. Your wives, your little ones, and your cattle shall remain in the land which Moses gave you on this side Jordan. But ye shall pass over before your brethren armed, all the mighty men of valor to help them, until Yahweh has given you. And he reminds them of their covenant. That's the very first act of Joshua. We cannot let the ecclesia become divided. Joshua 4 verse 12. As they pass over the river Jordan. I want you to notice something very fascinating about this. You know, when the book of Numbers starts off and the marching order of the tribes is established, Reuben, who should have led the nation, are in fourth place. Gad are somewhere near the back. And Judah is put up front of the marching order. So again, Reuben's been displaced in the marching order. But look what it says here. When they passed over Jordan, verse 11, it came to pass when they were clean passed over, the priests, the presence. Who's up front? The children of Reuben, the children of Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh passed over before the children of Israel. And Reuben has now been restored to the front of the marching order. Because of the covenant they made. About 40,000 prepared for war passed over. I think 40,000 each tribe. When you look at the numbers, it's about 40,000 from each tribe. And just notice the little phrase, before Yahweh to battle. Just tuck that one away. We'll come back to that one in a moment. And we come to Joshua 22, which will be the subject of our last talk. Years later, in Joshua 22, Joshua acknowledges the behaviour of Reuben, Gad and Manasseh. Verse 2, you have kept all that Moses the servant of Yahweh commanded you. You have obeyed my voice and all that I commanded you. You've not left your brethren these many days unto this day. You've kept the charge of the command of your God. And now God's given rest to your brethren. You can go back to your inheritance. And that was 7 years later. So this thing's come up 4 times in the divine record. By Moses, the first thing done by Joshua, they cross over with their brethren in front of the army, and they fulfilled their promise after 7 years, and they go back to their inheritance. How could they make such a promise, brethren and sisters? Well, I want you to come to Exodus 34. You know, Moses had said something, or God had said something on the mount, which was taken up by them as the basis of their offer. How could you offer to leave your families and your children unprotected by any army on the east of Jordan when all the displaced Moabites and Amalekites are out there? How could you leave your families with no protection? Well, in Exodus 34, you have a beautiful verse that talks about the going up to the feasts. And it says this: thrice in a year, verse 23, shall your men children appear before Yahweh, the God of Israel. So God says, I want all the men folk, except the old and decrepit and the little boys, I want everybody to go up and keep the 3 feasts at Jerusalem. And 2 of those feasts were at the time of harvest, at the end of harvest, which was the time that the Bible says that kings go to war. Because it's very hard to mobilise an army when there's snow on the ground. Napoleon learnt that. But kings go to war in Israel because at the end of harvest, conditions are good for camping in the open field, and there's plenty of spoil in the barns to take. And you go and plunder other people's harvest. And God said 2 of those feasts will be in the time of harvest. You leave your families and your barns unprotected and go up and keep my feasts. And I will sort out anybody who even thinks about coming near your property and your family that you left behind. And God says, you do that, and I will cast out the nations before you, enlarge your borders, and nobody will desire your land when you go up to keep the feasts of Yahweh. Now that is an incredible promise that requires a lot of faith to accept. Would you be prepared to live if you lived in the valley of Elah and the Philistines are just on the other side of the hill and they've seen you reap your harvest and fill your barns and your wine presses, and then you say to your grandparents and maybe to your wife who can't travel, well, I'll see you in a few weeks' time. We're going up to keep the feast. Look after yourselves, won't you? And the Philistines are there rubbing their hands and saying, oh, you look, they're all disappearing. God says they won't even dare come near your land. You think of the amount of angelic providence has to be in that. That their land, if they'd faithfully kept the feast, their land would not be touched. Now, I believe that Reuben and Gad had read that and said, that's the principle that God applies. We do the right thing by our brethren, and God will look after our families. And they were not disappointed. Just make a note against that verse of 2 Chronicles 17, verse 9 and 10. We haven't got time to go there, but, Jehoshaphat brought in Levites to teach Israel. And it says, as a result, God took away all their enemies from them. Because they gave attention to God's law, he protected them from all their enemies. And that's a great principle, isn't it? When you put God's work first, above selfish interest, God can begin to work around you. I want to just make a clarification on this. I am not saying to brethren that you can excuse yourself from family responsibilities by using the ecclesia as your excuse. Well, I'm too busy doing this talk, or I'm too busy doing this for the ecclesia to look after my family. It's not saying that. It's saying that when it comes to choices in life, there are plenty of things that are very low priorities when it comes to the work of God. We've got to do, brethren and sisters, what is right by God and what's right for our brethren and right for our families, and let God give the increase and to protect us. And if we're engaged on God's work, his angels will protect us and our families. And they were willing to leave their families on the east of Jordan unprotected by an army because they accepted that promise. Now, back in Numbers 32, let's go back there and look at one more thing that they did not have right, that Moses had to correct. Included in their wonderful offer was an imbalance, an incorrect perspective. If you've got a coloured pencil, colour it in verse 16 to verse 19, where they made this promise. Colour in the word we. We will go, or we will build sheepfolds. We will go until we have brought them into their place. We will not return. We will not inherit. And it's very much focused on what they're going to do for their brethren. You see, they had an incorrect perspective. And they said this in verse 17, we will go armed before the children of Israel until we have brought them into their place. Now, you notice in their statement, there's no mention of what God's going to do. So now they're saying to Moses, well, look, Moses, we made a bit of a mistake with that previous suggestion. But we will save the ecclesia. We'll go out and fight their battles for them. We'll do what you say. And it wasn't right, brethren and sisters. And Moses corrects them. There are 4 statements that Moses makes in reply. Look at verse 20. If you will go armed before Yahweh to war. Verse 22. If you go armed over Jordan before Yahweh to war. Until he, all right, so here's the contrast to the we, until he hath driven out his enemies from before him, and the land be subdued before Yahweh, not before you, then afterward you can go back and be guiltless before Yahweh. And this land shall be your possession before Yahweh. So Moses is correcting them, isn't he? It's not about what you're going to do for your brethren, it's about what Yahweh will do if you cooperate. And that's a big change of perspective they had to get. So their first perception was wrong. Now notice their spiritual progression. Verse 27. Thy servants will pass over, every man armed for the war, before Yahweh to battle, as my Lord saith. You see how humble they are, brethren and sisters? Moses, we're sorry. We thought it was us that were going to save our brethren. No, it's us working with our God to save our brethren. And Moses corrects them. And you can colour it into this record 4 times. Verse 29, Moses says, now let's just go over this again. If you got this right, if you will go over, every man armed to battle, before Yahweh. Verse 32, they come back and they say, okay, we heard what you said, we got it right now, we will pass over before Yahweh. You can't miss it, can you? Moses is correcting an incorrect perception that they would be saving their brethren. No, God does the saving, we cooperate with God. I'm going to come back to that to put up this quote from Brother Roberts. Israel were made to realise that while they could do nothing if God was not with them, he could not, in a sense, do his part unless they did theirs. There is a time to stand still and see the salvation of God, but not when he proposes to work by us. All the promises of God presuppose active, diligent, and courageous cooperation on the part of those to whom they are made. And brethren and sisters, we have to realise that the work of the truth is not about us. It's not about what we do. It's about us working with God and Yahweh going before us into the battle, putting our trust in what he can do to drive out the enemies of the truth. And they got the point. It was not about them going with their brethren to save their brethren. It was about Yahweh going before all of them and them being part of the cooperation. And that's a very clear principle that comes out. And so Moses says, verse 33, on the basis that you've now got it right, then you can have that kingdom of Sihon and Og. And that was incredible progress, the elders of Reuben, Gad and Manasseh. They responded, as my Lord saith. We get the message, Moses. We've now got it right. We see it better. And that's why it said in Joshua 4, they went over armed before Yahweh and their brethren. And you can see the change is then reflected later on. Now the progress is the great thing. We're going to see more progress when we come to Joshua 22. We're going to see it in the daughters of Zelophehad with the elders of Manasseh making progress spiritually. And that's the great lesson of these brethren. They learnt and they did what they said they would do. And they went for 7 years to fight with their brethren. 7 years of separation from their children and families. And in the end, they went back to the inheritance that they were given when the land was largely conquered. Now I want you to come to Deuteronomy 33. I said I would show you the difference in the blessings between Jacob and Moses. And the great difference in the 12 sons is in Reuben and Gad. You know, Jacob said, Reuben unstable as water, and Gad, a troop will overcome him. In other words, write him off. You come to Deuteronomy 33 and see what Moses says before he dies because of the covenant that they have made, of which he has reminded them. Deuteronomy 33, verse 6. Let Reuben live and not die, and let not his men be few. You know, the tribe of Reuben had suffered greatly in the wilderness because they were mixed up in the rebellion of Korah, in which 15,000 approximately died. Most of those came from Reuben. They're one of the two tribes whose numbers dropped in the wilderness, along with Simeon. And we know why with Simeon, because of the Balaam incident. But Reuben is the other tribe that drops in numerical strength. And Moses says, let Reuben live and not die, and let not his men be few. And the shame that he caused in his own father's family has been put aside. So Reuben will live, an optimistic part. And then you come down to verse 20 and 21, and the blessing on Gad. Look what he says there. And Gad, he said, blessed be he that enlargeth Gad. Wow, isn't that amazing? You got more than you were supposed to get. He dwells as a lion. He tears the arm of the crown of the head. He's a roaring, vicious lion. And look at this, verse 21. He secured, as it should be, he secured the first part for himself. The first tribes to get an inheritance were Reuben and Gad. How did they secure it? By making a promise to be faithful and to fight before Yahweh for their brethren. In a portion of the lawgiver was he seated. They became an important part in the council of Israel. He came with the heads of the people. He executed the justice of Yahweh and judgments with Israel. And this is a non-entity tribe which has now been exalted by the words of Moses because they made a faithful covenant. So, brethren and sisters, their response to Moses was mature. We now know we have to work with Yahweh alongside of our brethren. And we cannot be selfish. We have to commit to the work of the truth. What are the lessons we take away? Well, you know, in the New Testament, we have some wonderful expositions of walking together in unbroken rank. Paul observed Roman life around him, and particularly the soldiers. And he said this in Philippians chapter 1, let your way of life be as it becometh the gospel of Christ, in one mind, striving together for the faith of the gospel, and stand fast in the one spirit. And the word stand fast there is actually the word stoikio in the Greek. It means to march in unbroken rank. And he'd seen the lines of Roman soldiers. Readers of Asterix will know about the way the legionnaires line up. You know, the unbroken rank. One falls, another one takes their place. You know, that concept is a very biblical concept for ecclesial life. We have to be prepared to walk alongside of each other. In Galatians, Paul says, if we walk in the Spirit, let us walk together. Let's march together in unbroken rank. Those who become individualistic and want to go out in front, or those who fall out of line, leave a gap in our defences. We've got to look shoulder to shoulder and be aware of each other and how we impact each other with the choices we make. Walk in unbroken rank. And the individual has to be submerged in that. What we might want to do doesn't really matter. It's what the work of God is achieving, always abounding in the work of the Lord. So let's summarise the lessons from Reuben and Gad we've learnt this morning. Commitment to the brotherhood. You know, Peter says, love the brotherhood. Think about what we do and how it affects other people. And attendance and support of the ecclesial activities is not about just pleasing everybody else. It's about working with God, with our brethren, shoulder to shoulder, until the battle is over. And remember, it's God's work to cooperate and to work with our God. Consider the ramifications of our decisions upon other people. We can either inspire or discourage and break hearts. It's become rather unpopular to try and set an example for the believers. But the antidote to selfishness is the mind of Christ. It says in Romans 15 verse 3, we that are strong ought not to please ourselves, because Christ pleased not himself, We ought to submit and give and contribute and curb our liberties for the sake of our brethren and sisters. We do not have liberty to harm people by our thoughtlessness. By love, serve one another. Brethren and sisters, let us determine to march shoulder to shoulder towards Abraham's land, always abounding in the work of the Lord, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting and encouraging one another, stirring one another up, until all our brethren inherit the kingdom of God, and the battle will be over. Of God, and the battle will be over. Of God, and the battle will be over. Of God, and the battle will be over.